Welcome, everyone, to ICSS Sunday Morning Marxist Forum. My name is Alan Miller, and I'm a member of the Program Committee for ICSS Sunday Morning Sessions. We're based in Oakland, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. Our weekly programs are online via Zoom every Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. Pacific Time, and you can sign up at our website, icssmarks.org, to receive weekly email announcements for our Sunday sessions. You can also view videos of past presentations and send us a message using our contact form on our website, which again is icssmarks.org. We also want to call your attention to our donation page where you can make a donation to support our programs. We have a great program today. The title is Trumponomics and U.S. Empire's Approaching Crisis. Our speaker, Professor Jack Rasmus, will help us to better understand important events of the day, including why Trump wants to end the Ukraine war, what's up with the U.S., NATO, and Europe, and why the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, proposes a $2 trillion $2 trillion in cuts to foreign aid and domestic U.S. spending. Dr. Rasmus teaches economics at St. Mary's College of California and is the author of numerous books, including The Scourge of Neoliberalism, Central Bankers at the End of Their Rope, and forthcoming in October, The Twilight of American Imperialism, which we're really looking forward to. Not the Twilight, but the book, both. He's the host of a weekly radio show, Alternative Visions, and a journalist who writes for numerous publications. Jack also has a long history of working in the labor movement as a union president, contract negotiator, and organizer for several unions, including the UAW, CWA, and SEIU. His website is jackrasmus.com, and his Twitter handle is Dr. Jack Rasmus. And Jack has actually spoken many times on our Sunday morning sessions. As usual, we're going to start with a presentation, and after that, a short break for announcements, followed by a group discussion where you can express your views and ask your questions on today's topics. There's so much happening right now. We expect to have a very lively and informative session. So welcome back, Professor Rasmus. We're really happy to have you.
My pleasure. Okay, should we just start?
Yeah, just go ahead. Sure.
Okay. All right, so the topic today is trying to understand what the hell Trump is doing. It seems pretty radical, doesn't it? And he's popping off a lot of these strange, extreme positions, it appears. And it seems to be pretty chaotic. And the Democrats are just sort of saying, he's attacking democracy and et cetera. Democrats really don't understand, at least in their public statements, what the hell's going on. And we'll talk about that a bit. But first we got to understand, well, what's all this chaos that appears to be chaos in domestic policy and in foreign policy? Some radical developments, at least they appear to be. Trump trying to put down and pull out of the Ukraine war and all the conflict with NATO going on, and likely pull out of NATO that's coming. What's all this Greenland and Panama Canal thing? What's all this about? What's the policy towards China here? Tariffs, etc. Well, it's not so crazy if you try to understand it in context and historically here with the U.S. Basically, fundamentally, what we've got is the U.S. empire is in trouble. It's not collapsing. There's some people on the left saying, oh, it's collapsing. No, it's not collapsing, but it is facing intensifying contradictions. And it's having some real problems trying to pay for itself. It can't afford. The elite, at least some of them, have come to the conclusion that as structured, the U.S. empire is no longer affordable. So it has to be restructured so it is affordable. And that's kind of the theme that I'm focusing on here. You can understand what's going on in domestic and foreign policy if you understand that behind it all, there is a imminent imperial restructuring going on, or an attempt to, early stages. And that includes domestic policy too, not just foreign policy, because they're all interlinked. It's all part of the cost, you see, of running the empire. There's a domestic element and an international element to the empire. So restructuring of the empire is the theme here. And it's also the flip side of that coin is neoliberal policies, because neoliberal policies, which took root in the late 70s, early 80s, and continued to expand, were really about restoring U.S. global economic hegemony abroad and whacking the social movements and unions and workers domestically. It's a very class-based policy, and neoliberalism is really imperialism. I've always had reservations about using the term neoliberal instead of imperial. Neoliberal is kind of concocted by academics, to, I think, obfuscate the fact that this is an imperial policy here, neoliberalism, and it worked. In terms of interclass, capitalist class conflict, it pretty much tamed its challengers in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, who were mostly Europe and especially Japan and the USSR. It successfully tamed those. It also tamed the social movements, the unions, and we'll talk about that, and workers, and the social movements that were associated with the 70s. So neoliberalism as an imperial restructuring set of policies, economic and political, were quite successful. But they generated their own internal contradictions. And by the 21st century, the end of the first decade, 21st century, those contradictions began to intensify. And since at least 2008 here, we've seen the growing contradictions in neoliberal policies, attempts to resurrect it to its apex period in the late 90s, early 2000s, to of no avail here. There's trouble trying to resurrect neoliberalism. It hasn't collapsed, but it is certainly not as efficient in working as it was before. So you got to understand what's going on with Trump is both an attempt to restore neoliberal policy effectiveness, which served the empire well, and the empire itself. Let's look back historically here on the whole idea of restructuring going on. American capitalism has restructured itself on several occasions here, at least 4 times in the last century. The first restructuring occurred back in 1914-19, again, associated with the First World War. It was pretty obvious World War was coming here as early as 1912. And the U.S. began to restructure itself in anticipation of participating in that war. In the Spanish-American War, 1898, 1903, what happened there was they did not have a fiscal basis for an imperial war strategy, the USA. How did they finance that Spanish-American War? Well, they taxed property owners. And that caused a lot of heartburn by a lot of capitalists. They didn't want to really pay themselves, and only certain capitalists, who had a lot of property, ended up paying. So there was a realization that they had to establish a new fiscal policy here if the U.S. was going to take its place on the global stage. You see, the Spanish-American War was the first sort of entry onto the global imperial stage. It's small entry here compared to UK and France. But they saw World War I coming, and the elite, understood that they couldn't finance that participation once again the way they did the Spanish-American War. So what did they do? They developed the income tax. in 1914-15, the corporate income tax and the personal income tax. By the way, the personal income tax really just taxed capitalists and the wealthy. It didn't really apply to the working class. That would not really happen until the Second World War. So you got this new fiscal basis. You also got the creation of the Federal Reserve, the central bank in 1914. So you have fiscal monetary policy now that would enable the U.S. to step onto the global stage, which the U.S. did, and it established a new role for the dollar. You see, the Fed, when it was created, was really completely run by the banks themselves, especially the New York banks. And the New York banks took over the role of managing the dollar on the global stage. It was a creation of the New York banks, really. And part of the Fed Act was to create a monopoly over the issuance of the dollar, the currency, a monopoly of the currency, so that New York banks could play a role of using the dollar to expand abroad into Europe and elsewhere. And the dollar became like a co-currency along with the pound in the 1920s as a result. So there's what we call an external policy, a dollar policy. And of course, the U.S. At that time was the global manufacturing hegemon of the world, kind of like China is today, and U.S. trade. You got to control your currency in the dollar if you want to expand your trade relationships and your capital investment abroad. You see, so you had to create the dollar and the Fed and the New York Fed as a means of expanding the empire into the rest of the world. Well, that was part of the restructuring around the First World War. There were industrial restructurings as well. The unions were allowed to expand in the war industries temporarily, and then they were busted right after the war. But you had the government involved in the economy for the first time, managing war mobilization and war production. Okay, so those are fiscal, monetary, industrial, and dollar trade policies that were all quite new and were all part of enabling the empire to expand, and they worked. Okay, but they broke down with the Great Depression, right, and the wars that happened. These restructurings don't last forever. They work in a certain context of economic relations and states, relations between states at the particular time. But what works at a particular time develops its own contradictions over time, and it does not work so well. And that's when they have to do another restructuring to come up with a different mix of fiscal, monetary, industrial, and external policies and political institutions to enable those economic policies to take effect. Political institutions have to change to enable and to assist the new policies. Well, the second restructuring begins in the midst of World War II in 1944. In sort of event apex is the Bretton Woods Agreement coming out of World War II in 1944. Well, what happened there? Well, external policy was dramatically restructured here. The dollar became the global currency, no longer really sharing that role with the British pound. Europe destroyed itself pretty much economically, pretty much gave up its empire to the U.S. capitalists as a result of World War II, and became junior partners with the U.S. here in global hegemony. But it was the dollar that became the dominant currency, right? And that was enabled by the creation of the IMF and the World Bank and the dollar system and so forth. That was a big change. A big change in fiscal policy. The whole idea of boosting the economy through war and defense spending became institutionalized. And it continued after World War II. It just shifted to new weapons production and so forth, the Cold War, et cetera. So fiscal policy was pretty much what we recognize today. It was World War II that really revolutionized fiscal policy on the defense side. It wasn't the 1930s, which was a foray into domestic social programs, which, to some extent were rolled back after World War II. The restructuring post-War II, World War II restructuring also included taming the unions again. Taft-Hartley Act in 47 was really the indication of that. The unions had expanded by organizing new areas and jurisdictions during the 30s and really grew most during the 40s when there was a policy of, okay, in exchange for a wage freeze, you unions could have all the members you wanted, and management would not resist it. People used to join the unions as employment rose simply by signing a card at the time that they were hired. There was no really attempt to prevent unionization. But after the Second World War, the power of the unions was severely restricted here, particularly the right to strike. You should think of Taft-Hartley as a series of measures designed to pull away the ability of unions to strike, and it worked. And the few loopholes left were closed, a decade later with the Landon-Griffin Act. So post-war, taming the unions again, that was part of the restructuring, and it worked. After Taft-Hartley, the only union gains were because of pretty much growth of the industries, not because of new organizing, until we got to the 60s and 70s and the public workers began to organize. But that's a later story. So the restructuring after World War II, new fiscal policy, the monetary policy was, okay, Fed, all we want you to do is to issue bonds to restore the government debt. That's and then after 10 years that was completed. But the Fed was not allowed to engage in monetary manipulation, with interest rates. So the interest rates were set according to the need to restore the debt, not to try to increase production or slow the economy or anything like that. The Fed was in the 1930s was put in the doghouse by FDR and wasn't let out until Eisenhower. So those were new policies. External, the U.S. was the global exporter. There was no one else to compete with it because the rest of the world was on its knees. And that meant the dollar, was in great demand because it was really the main currency now. There were no competitive currencies. So you see the mixes of fiscal, monetary, industrial, and external policies that enabled the expansion of the empire in World War I and after, and then once again in World War II and after, a different mix of these policies. And then, of course, they lasted for another 3 decades effectively. But in the 60s and 70s, the contradictions of that post-World War II policy mix broke down once again, and we had the crisis of the 70s. And out of the crisis of the 70s, what was the crisis? Well, growing competition on the part of Japan and Europe to the American dominance, as well as new aggressiveness politically by the USSR in a limited sense, but nonetheless a challenge from the USSR, in Africa and places like that. And also the crisis of inflation, right? Well, what was that? That was supply side, because part of the crisis of the 70s was the nationalization of the oil fields in the, in the Middle East and in North Africa. And certain reforms came out of that. But the crisis of oil and who's going to control the oil, the chronic inflation of the 70s, the challenge from Japan and Europe to some extent, and also the USSR, domestic movements of various kinds in the U.S., and the unions challenge. People, our history is not really clarified for folks, but the biggest strike wave that occurred in U.S. history was not during or after World War II. It was in 1970-71. That's when the big construction unions, which used to have geographic contracts. At one time there was one construction contract for all North California, and all the construction trades were part of it. Of course, now it's all fragmented. But there was a big construction, powerful construction unions went on strike and got big wage gains in 70-71. And that was followed by the Teamsters. And that was followed by the auto workers and the other industrial workers and longshore workers, transport workers. The unions got 25% raises in the first year of a 3-year contract in 70-71. Think about it. The capitalists could not control the unions anymore. So what did they got? They got Richard Nixon to step in and institute a wage freeze and roll back that 25% gain to 5.5%. The state began to play a role here. And of course, that was the time when we got this Powell memorandum about, the threat from social movements and labor and so forth. That was kind of a signal to the capitalist class, we got to restructure this thing. The crisis of the 70s drifted into the second half of the 70s because of Watergate and the elites being pretty much confused as to what to do. But by the late 70s, big business had formed new institutions like the Business Council and the Business Roundtable, and they had come up with a new set of strategies and proposals, which they began implementing in the last years of the Carter administration after 78. So neoliberalism really began 78, 79, at least the template of it. And then when Reagan comes into power in 81 and after, neoliberalism, the third restructuring, begins. That I sort of spoke to a little bit here. The third restructuring. And then we get a new mix for the empire, a new mix of fiscal, monetary, industrial, and external policies. Taming of the challengers, capitalist challengers. Japan and Europe occurred in the mid-decades in the Plaza Accords that tamed Japan, reversed its challenge, and set in motion Japan's economic problems. The Louvre Agreement, also in 86, was another example of taming challengers. Of course, the moves to undermine the Soviet Union and Afghanistan were well underway. So the idea of neoliberalism as an imperial policy was well obvious by that time. Domestically, taming labor. How did they tame labor? Well, they just deregulated the hell out of industries, and they offshored, passed tax legislation to give tax cuts to companies that offshored. They deregulated global capital flows here to enable the dollar and money capital to finance the global expansion of American capital that began in the 80s. It just flooded offshore, right? They changed the pension system, replaced real pensions with 401ks. They introduced part-time work for the first time. The deindustrialization and the loss of manufacturing jobs was replaced with low-paid service jobs at that time. We had the beginning of contingent labor, part-time temp work. Tens of millions of people began. The part-timers in the 80s, the temps in the 90s, by changing the labor laws and the rules, both through the courts and through the NLRB and so forth. So it was really taming of labor in the unions, and a period of decades-long wage compression followed until this very day. Real wages for the working class since 1982-83 are lower than they were in real terms in 82 and 83. And all this attempts by liberal and mainstream economists to say, wages are rising. which is nonsense because they cherry pick just a certain section of the labor force. Usually those are full-time workers. They never say that the part-time workers and the discouraged workers and so forth are getting their real wages reduced. Anyway, that's another problem with statistics that exist today. They're not very accurate, in my opinion, whether you're talking about employment, whether you're talking about inflation. That's another story. But basically, the unions were tamed with neoliberalism. Were busted, really, on the private sector. Busted industrial unions, in particular, transport unions. The only unions that were able to sort of protect themselves and continue were the public employees, the public workers. But the private sector was devastated. Today, what do you got? Less than 6% of the private sector unionized? Less than 6%. In 1980, it was 22%. Okay, now it's 6%. That's an example. And the techniques were various, as I said, offshoring and deregulation and changes in the NLRB and the court rules about no striking and so forth. And we issued in a long period of concession bargaining that only recently in the last couple of years shows some signs of being ended here with the largest most powerful unions, the Teamsters and auto workers and so forth, after they had a major change of leadership, you see, because part of this whole thing is you control the leadership and you control the unions. And there are all kinds of ways that they can control the leadership through financial means and political means and so forth. Anyway, the unions were devastated. Wage compression set in. The union wage differential shrunk. Smaller service employment, more difficult to unionize, organize occurred. You move to right-to-work states were expanded here, or the jobs were just offshored altogether to Asia. That's how they kept wages compressed, and of course they replaced the real pension plans with phony 401ks. And then they shifted the cost of health insurance onto the backs of workers to the benefit of management. So these were all forms of industrial policy and deregulation, of course, of industries and deregulation of finance, which in the early part of this century ended up with financial deregulation and the bust that occurred in 2008. These are all ways of assisting of capital to expand, and thus the empire itself. Expand domestically within the U.S., expand geographically outside the U.S., and that's what neoliberalism really is about. On the external side, of course, we got the financialization, which meant eliminating flows on money capital, globally across countries. There used to be a lot of controls on money flows. Well, those were all eliminated, and we saw the expansion of U.S. capital, finance capital. The hallmarks of neoliberal restructuring are globalization, which is really another way for imperial foreign investment, right? And then, of course, financialization, because when you talk about global expansion, it's not just with goods production, it's with money flows. And in terms of Federal Reserve and monetary policy, the hallmark of the neoliberal restructuring is low interest rates caused by flooding the economy, both U.S. and global, with free money. That's what the Fed has done since 1986, free money. It's called the Greenspan put, right? And that, of course, is, financed all the financial speculation, and with it, the financial fragility and instability it has produced in the U.S. and globally, in these periodic explosions, financial speculation and explosions that go on. The latest brewing, of course, is the crypto thing. And other forms of financial speculation going on with derivatives, etc. Okay, so you got to understand that neoliberal restructuring, fiscal policy, monetary policy, external policy, part of this was the creation of the WTO, World Trade Organization, because that was a concession by the U.S. capitalists to the rest of the global South, which was growing in terms of its influence as it industrialized here. So they sort of gave that concession because the U.S. in the previous restructurings maintained total control over exports and of goods and money capital. So, they allowed a small reform here in the late 90s. And then the U.S. capitalists, all the free trade expansion, that's part of the external policy in the neoliberal period, which pretty much came to a halt here in the last decade or so. But free trade, that's part of these external policies. So anyway, that's the set of neoliberal policies. Just to recap, neoliberalism is unlimited defense and war spending, austerity on social program spending. Of course, that ebbs and flows, right? It's not constant all the time, but that's the long-term trend in fiscal policy, and also tax cuts. That's fiscal policy. Tax cuts designed to subsidize investment, business tax cuts, not so much consumer tax cuts, right? That's fiscal policy. Tax cuts for business and investors, right? Austerity social programs, war, defense spending expansion. Now, the consequence of that is annual deficits and accumulation of the national debt, which is just a summary of annual deficits. That's been occurring under neoliberalism since Reagan. If you look at what we got in terms of deficits and debt, the national debt when Reagan came in was less than $1 trillion, or just about $1 trillion national debt, right? By 2000, the national debt was $5.5 trillion. So over 20 years, it goes from 1 trillion to 5.5 trillion. Okay, by the time George W. Bush leaves, it's almost 10 trillion. By the time Obama leaves, it's 26 trillion. And now it's probably about $37 trillion. So you see this acceleration of the national debt, which is a result of annual deficits accelerating, growing. We are now running, since 2020, we've been running annual deficits here, fiscal deficits of well over $1 trillion a year. Like last year was 1.8 trillion. Now we're running on a $2 trillion plus rate of national of deficit, and 36 trillion national, 37 trillion national debt. The Congressional Budget Office, by the way, the research arm of Congress, has a forecast that the national debt is going to go to $56 trillion by 2034, unless some dramatic changes in fiscal policy occur. 56 trillion. We are now paying $1 trillion on our current $36 trillion national debt. We are paying $1 trillion to bondholders, because if you run a deficit, right, you got to borrow the money by issuing treasury bonds, right? You issue treasury bonds, you got to pay interest to the buyers of those bonds. By the way, a third of the buyers of the bonds are offshore. Okay, so we're paying $1 trillion a year now, which comes out of the discretionary budget of the U.S., $1 trillion a year, just to bondholders. On top of that, we're spending defense $1.3 trillion, $900 billion alone to the Pentagon and rising, $900 billion, okay? And the other $300-400 billion are the other areas of what's really national defense, like the Energy Department.
Froze.
All of the, did someone say something? Okay.
You were frozen for a few minutes. Maybe you can repeat the last few sentences.
Okay, I'm talking about the debt, the national debt and the deficits, okay? And I'm talking about $37 trillion of national debt now, and running deficits well over $2 trillion a year. Okay, think of those numbers, $2 trillion a year, right? And a national debt 37, interest rates on the national debt are costing $1 trillion a year now. According to the CBO, by 10 years from now, the national debt will be 56 trillion, and the interest payments to bondholders 1.7 trillion every year. Okay, keep that in mind because it's unaffordable. They can't continue that fiscal policy anymore. It's too expensive. You can't keep paying bondholders $1 to $2 trillion a year and paying the military industrial complex and the Pentagon $1 to $2 trillion a year and cut your taxes, mostly to businesses, even further. How much have we cut taxes since 2001? $17 trillion in tax cuts. How much have we spent on wars? $9 trillion. So the tax cuts and the wars, i.e. fiscal policy, 26 trillion of the $36 trillion national debt. It's unsustainable. You know, never in the US history have we cut taxes, including that much, while we increased war spending that much. You know, usually in the world wars, we raise taxes on the rich, particularly in order to help fund the wars. We're doing ass backwards here. We, the U.S. empire, is doing ass backwards. It can't sustain that kind of a policy of tax cuts at the same time that you're increasing defense and war spending. It's just unsustainable. You end up with $2 trillion a year deficits. And on top of that $2 trillion a year, you're paying $1 trillion plus to bondholders who are the rich. Corporations, banks, wealthy individuals buy bonds, treasury bonds. Right? It's a formula that's unsustainable, and it shows the contradictions of fiscal and monetary policy. Basically, that contradiction is, in terms of fiscal policy, government spending and tax cuts don't get directed into the real economy as much as they used to. A lot of it funds financial asset speculation and offshore investment. So the amount of what they have to provide in tax cuts and spending increases has to increase, because less and less of it is actually getting into the real economy. The same thing with the Federal Reserve, interest rate policy. They got to lower rates even more and more to stimulate any real investment, right? Or when you get inflation, they have to raise it higher, which they can't do because, as we saw recently, 6% interest rates were the max they could do because they were starting to precipitate financial instability in the regional banking system. So they can't raise interest rates as much as anymore. They have to lower them to zero if they want to stimulate the real economy. The problem is financialization and globalization has meant that fiscal and monetary policies are less effective, and they got to throw more and more money to get a bang for the buck. But that more and more money means more and more bigger deficits and interest payments and so forth. So you get now to Trump, right? And what do we see? What do we see is an attempt, in my opinion, to cut the cost of empire so that they can fund weapons, you see, because the U.S. is behind in terms of weapons development, behind China and Russia. The U.S. drone development is behind, and the U.S. hypersonic missiles is behind. In other areas of technology, the U.S. is apparently behind. So they've got to find money to invest in these new weapon systems. Where are they trying to find it? They're cutting all this waste in maintaining the global empire. You know, they're cutting US aid that adds nothing to US weapons development, adds nothing to the US economy. It's wasted money in terms of GDP, National Endowment for the Democracy, all the CIA's wars. You know, this is money, the Middle East wars, this is money that is thrown down the crapper. It doesn't really provide for defense anymore. They've got to find ways of reinvesting the weapons and restructuring the Pentagon to cut waste there too, so that they can move that spending into where they really need it. And that's how you should see what's going on with Trump with the Ukraine war and even NATO. Trump and that wing of the capitalists realize that, we're throwing all this money at NATO and it's not necessary. Let the Europeans do their own defense and we can save, all kinds of billions of dollars. And then the Ukraine war is just an extension of that, an extension of NATO and an illustration of terrible waste. $300-400 billion we've thrown down that rat hole called Ukraine, right? Trump wants to consolidate the empire. He wants to cut the costs. He wants to get out of NATO, at least by stages, right? Cut that cost. He wants to quickly cut the cost of Ukraine. All the 800 bases around the world, a lot of those are not needed. He'll cut that. All the foreign aid will be cut, except, of course, for Israel. And then we've got other reductions. They're looking for reductions elsewhere. Look at the Pentagon. When we came out of World War II, we had 4 4-star generals and 1 4-star admiral. You know how many we have today, 4-star generals? 45. 45. It's an example of how you got this bureaucratic bloat that's occurred because of the empire. A bureaucratic bloat has occurred here, and they're trying to cut out some of that bloat. But keep in mind, it's not that they want to cut defense spending. They want to move the money around. That's what they want to do. And that's the key thrust here of what we're looking at. We're also looking at a struggle going on between the government, the elected part of the system, and the capitalist state, the bureaucratic apparatus, which has grown in size and cost and power over the elected government. And what you got is the government trying to regain control over that bureaucratic state apparatus. Usually that occurs when you have socialist revolutions. We can go back to the Paris Commune in 1870, 71. What happened there? Well, we had there was an uprising. The workers took over Paris, and then they took over the government, and then they went to the Bank of France, Bank of Paris, and said, "We want your gold because we want to restructure the economy," right? And the bankers talked them out of it. You see, they talked them out of giving them the gold, the revolution, the gold, and the workers walked away and okay, and what did the bank do with the gold? Well, it gave it to the Prussians to come in and crush the revolution, which is what they did. So, Marx had concluded you got to smash the bureaucratic state apparatus. Well, that usually works, in a revolution, or 1917, 18 as well, and then in China in the 40s. But what we got now is kind of a struggle between the government that wants to restore control over the state apparatus and savings there because it is bloated as hell. But you got the Democrats aligned with the bureaucracy and the mainstream media aligned with the bureaucracy. They don't want to change the structure of the empire, you see. Trump realizes that the empire can't be sustained, wants to change it, wants to move the money around, but you've got the resistance on this other side of this. You got to split the capitalist class going on over what to do with the contradictions of empire, in my view. Then you got the tax cuts, right? That's fiscal policy. He's trying to change the tax cuts, but not fundamentally. Not fundamentally. He wants to give more tax cuts for investors to stimulate the economy, because since 2008, the U.S. economy, given current fiscal monetary policy, is not growing. We had the crash of 2008-9, negative GDP. We had $787 billion fiscal stimulus by Obama in 2009 and 10, right? It didn't have a strong effect on the economy for reasons I talked about before. And we had a growth rate of only 2/3 of normal coming out of 2008 and 9. It was a very slow growth rate. It took 6 years to get the jobs back that we lost in the crash, right? That's a chronic problem. That's an indicator of fiscal monetary policy not working the way it used to. Then we get Trump. Trump comes in and he gets this big tax cut in 2018. It doesn't really stimulate investment. And it's hard to tell what its long-term effect would be, because then we have the crash of 2020, 21. And, I'm not convinced that that wasn't purposely done for political reasons because of the splits in the elite. But anyway, we have the crash of 2021, which is even worse than the crash of 2008. And we come out of that crash, we spend $6.7 trillion of fiscal stimulus. Obama spends $1 trillion of fiscal stimulus and gets a weak recovery, right? In 2020, we spend $6.7 trillion of government spending and tax cuts to deal with that crash. 3.1 trillion in 2020 under Trump and a Democrat Congress. 2021, another $3.7 trillion, $1.9 trillion for stimulus, direct stimulus, the American Relief Plan. 1.7 trillion where Biden took some of the money and threw other money in and gave subsidies to business investment. The infrastructure bill, the CHIPS modernization bill, and the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. $1.7 trillion of subsidies and tax cuts and grants to business, because in 2022 the economy entered a double dip recession that they don't talk about much, right? So that was $6.7 trillion. And what did we get out of $6.7 trillion plus another $4 trillion of stimulus, monetary stimulus by the Fed? $10 trillion were spent in 2021-22 to stimulate the economy. What did we get? Well, the first full years of recovery, not reopening the economy, but recovery, 22, 23, 24, we've barely averaged 2% GDP growth. $10 trillion gets you a 2.0 GDP growth. It's not working. It's not fiscal monetary policy is not stimulating the economy the way it used to, because a lot of it's getting siphoned off into financial assets in the rest of the world. You see, financialization and globalization, imperialism, right, is undermining the domestic economy and making, domestic policy ineffective. And the result of that ineffectiveness is what? It's rising deficits and debt. That's the consequence. That's the indicator that the policies are in contradiction. Increasingly, they're not working. The same thing with external policy. Over the period of the neoliberalism, the role of the dollar is shrinking. It's shrinking. It's only 50% or so, I think, of a transaction currency, 50% of reserve currency. So it's been shrinking, and that means less power. And then, of course, we get the Ukraine war. In all these cases, we've seen the shift and a restructuring occur because of wars. The wars accelerate the whole process. World War I accelerated it. World War II, right? Vietnam and that crisis in the 70s. And now we see Ukraine. These contradictions were occurring and developing anyway, but they get accelerated when you have a war. And that's exactly what's happening with this war in Ukraine, because associated with it are these external policies of sanctions on Russia, which aren't working on Russia, but are, impacting the hell out of Germany and Western Europe. Right? But the idea of the sanctions as a war policy here is accelerating the decline of the dollar and the rise of the BRICS. The BRICS were growing slowly, but if you look at it now, they're expanding rapidly here as a result of the sanctions policy, because the sanctions are a threat to these countries. If you don't play by the dollar, then we're going to take action and primarily not allow you access to the dollar here, and therefore buying things that you need in exports and imports. So the sanctions have exacerbated the crisis of external policy and the role of the dollar here long term. A big difference today with the crisis here at this particular point and the effort. Think of Trump's policies as an initial effort to try to restore neoliberalism and or to restructure the economy. We're only at the very beginning, and it's not clear whether he's going to succeed in doing this, but that's really what this is about. And it's more difficult this time, I think, than ever before to restructure. Why? Because the external policy restructuring with the problem of the BRICS and the sanctions and so forth represents a competitor threat to the empire greater than any of them before. Certainly greater than Japan and Europe in the 80s, right? The BRICS are a global industrialized sector of the global economy that poses a major threat to the American empire, a greater threat than ever before. Why? Because this is not at 1985 anymore. The US, when it introduced neoliberalism, simply turned on Japan and Europe, and it browbeat them into submission, economic submission. The relationship of power between the U.S. empire and those challenges was such that the U.S. just overwhelmed them. The U.S. undermined the USSR in the 80s, particularly with provoking this Afghan war. That's another story. That was a U.S. policy under Carter. Anyway, the threats were more easily dealt with at that time than now. The global South is not the South of the 1980s. It is an industrial powerhouse, not just China, but countries like India, Brazil, Indonesia, and so forth. And the U.S. can't manipulate them and threaten them the way they used to or could back in the 1980s. These countries are forming slowly, carefully, the BRICS, and the BRICS are the big strategic challenge to the empire. And I think, in Washington, they're beginning to realize that far greater a threat than Ukraine and Russia. That is such a dumb imperial war. Biden will go down in history as, the president that policies that most undermined the empire. He shot the empire in both feet here with his policies. Anyway, they're trying to recover from that war and get the hell out of there, stop throwing money down that toilet. And even Europe's, the bigger toilet. They're wasting all this money on protecting Europe so that Europe can not provide for its own defense and provide all these nice social benefits to its people. Once the U.S. pulls out and Europe has to do their own defense, well, watch those social benefits go away. In fact, the Financial Times just last week came out with an article, and that article said pretty much, okay, we got a war policy now. We got to, remilitarize in Europe. It's going to cost us $800 billion to start, is what they're talking about. And the Germans are talking about $540 billion. Europe's economy has been stagnant for years. Where are they going to get that money? Well, they're going to have to take it from the working class. And that's what that Financial Times article said, pretty much. Well, warfare state for the welfare state is how they put it. I forget the exact headline, but, it was posed that get ready, because we're going to have to cut these social benefits if we want to spend $1 trillion, which they just announced, on remilitarizing Europe. So the U.S. is just dumping the problem of a war system, a war production onto the Europeans, which is going to take them years because there is no real in-depth military industrial production in Western Europe. They have to recreate it all over again. So At the same time, Trump is saying to them, well, Ukraine's your baby. You do what you want with it, right? You fund it. And the Europeans are struggling to raise bonds and so forth. And they're sitting on $300 billion of frozen Russian assets, and they're going to use that. But if they use that, they're sending a message to the BRICS that, oh, your money in Western European banks, we can just take it if we want. And that's not going over too well. With the BRICS. And in fact, Saudi Arabia has told France, he said, you take that Russian money, we're taking our money out of your banks, right? If they do that, if there's outflow of all the investments, particularly from the Middle East, out of the European banks, guess what happens to European currency? It collapses. That's what happens. Big crisis. So the Europeans are between a rock and a hard place. How do we fund this continued war in Ukraine with the U.S. pulling out? And without taking the Russian frozen assets, they've tried to raise bonds a certain way, and they can't do it. Last year they failed. Right? No one wants to buy bonds for Ukraine. I mean, that's risky. Right? Who's going to pay us back if Ukraine collapses and we lose our money? Right? Well, are your European countries going to guarantee that if Ukraine can't pay back the bonds, that you're going to be liable for it? Oh, no, we don't want to be liable. So the private sector says, well, go to hell. We can put our money somewhere else, less risky. We're not buying your Ukraine bonds. So Europe is between a rock and a hard place. How do they reindustrialize and remilitarize without raising bonds? And without saying those bonds are going to be used for Ukraine? They're between a rock and a hard place. They know it. They're panicking. They're holding these emergency conferences and everything. And there's nothing they can do. Trump pretty much has them on a string, I think. And if the U.S. pulls out, well, what's that? That's all that spending going into the Western European economy is going to be pulled out as well. And the economies are stagnant now. What the hell are they going to do? Okay, so that's Europe. You see, Europe is going to be relegated to a backwater in the global economic and political system here. It's the BRICS with China and Russia versus the U.S. And the U.S. is trying to consolidate the empire, first because of the cost. They can't afford them. They're cutting out all the fat, right? Because they got to fund the new weapons development if they're going to focus on China. They're consolidating back to the Western Hemisphere and to protect their lake called the Pacific Ocean. You see, all this stuff in the Middle East and all this stuff in Europe has proven over 20 years to be a total waste here for the empire. And the empire cannot continue to fund NATO, Ukraine, Middle East, going after China, right? Maintain the empire all around the world with 800 bases. They cannot do it anymore, and they know that. And they're restructuring fiscal policy and monetary and external policy as a response to this crisis. And that's how you need to understand what's going on, the domestic and the global. I mean, look, what's Greenland and Panama Canal about? That's Western consolidation of the empire. The U.S. is looking at Russia, which has a well-developed Arctic strategy, and the Arctic is drying out, and I would say drying out, but the ice flows are opening up a constant passage now, through the Arctic. Russia has this well-developed Arctic strategy. I think they got like 50 icebreakers or whatever, and the U.S. has 2, right? The U.S., of course, has Alaska at one end of the Arctic. What's at the other end? Greenland. They need Greenland, and they need Canada's far north to develop their own Arctic strategy. That's what's behind it. And of course, there may be minerals in Greenland as well. It's about competing globally with the Russians in terms of Arctic strategy. What about Panama Canal? Well, all the initiatives against the Panama Canal by the U.S. has to do with China. That's penetrating, was buying up parts of the Panama Canal and cutting deals with, Panama, the country here. And the U.S. has stepped in and said, no, Panama, kick them out, kick China out, kick them out of these initiatives, these economic initiatives, and that's exactly what Panama has done so far. And now, just last week, we got news that Blackhawk is buying up the ports on both sides of the Panama Canal. That's the first stage. The U.S. will take over the Panama Canal. They may leave some token, legal arrangement for Panama, but that's going to be taken back by the U.S. already is in the process. Trump will get Greenland, okay? But this is part of the Western Hemisphere consolidation after decades of pissing away in the Middle East, which the U.S. doesn't need Middle East oil anymore. It's got a glut of oil because of new technologies and fracking here in North America. They don't need it the way they needed it in the past. And, besides, there's a nice relationship between Saudi Arabia, MBS, and Trump here, right? They're not worried about the oil anymore to the extent they were 40 years ago. Technology has enabled that. So you've got a change in the political arrangements, the political institutions as we restructure, less emphasis on UN institutions and on NATO and so forth, and reestablishment of new relationships that we're going to see. We have a change in fiscal policy as we try to move the money around to protect the empire. Monetary policy has not changed so far, but I predict there'll be a clash between Trump and Fed Chair Powell before this is over to get Powell to reduce interest rates, because neoliberalism requires low interest rates. And right now they're too high. And that independence of the Fed, we saw that during Trump's first term. He browbeat the Fed and got them to reverse their interest rate hikes in 2017. Well, he's going to do it again. But right now he's preoccupied with getting the legislation passed here for the tax cuts to continue and this whole restructuring of fiscal spending that's going on. By the way, the tax cuts, people aren't too aware because the mainstream media won't say much about it, but in tax cuts are $1 trillion of embedded middle class, working class tax cuts. There's $1 trillion of tax cuts in there. What are they? No tax on tips, that's $100 billion that could be returned to workers, right? No tax on overtime, that's $250 billion that could be returned. This is over 10 years. Eliminate the tax on Social Security benefits and checks, which Reagan instituted back in the 1980s. Before Reagan, Grandma and Grandpa weren't paying any tax on their Social Security benefits, right? And then, of course, you got Clinton in the 90s, and he upped that to 85% tax on Social Security benefits, right? $550 billion if you end taxing on Social Security benefits, goes back to the working and middle class, $550 billion. And then there's the SALT deduction. SALT is state and local taxes, right? Right now, there's a limit of 10,000 on it. If you double that to 20,000 deduction limit, that would add another $170 billion, mostly going to homeowners, which are mostly middle class. So you got over $1 trillion in tax cuts, plus Trump announced here in his speech last week another tax cut in the form of if you buy a new US-made car, your interest on your monthly payments is going to be tax deductible. So we got embedded in that bill some very interesting working class oriented middle class tax cuts that are going to benefit workers. But what about the Democrats? Are they saying anything about it? Not a word. They originated Social Security, but are they saying, yeah, let's eliminate the taxing of Social Security income? Not a word, because it comes from Trump, right? They won't give him any concession, even if it means something for the working class, right? Very interesting. Let's watch what happens there, how the Democrats will vote in the Senate, because it will pass the House, but it'll, the Senate showing signs they're going to whack that all back, right? And the Democrats in the Senate will be taking the lead on that as well. I listened to the speech, Trump's speech here, and took copious notes on everything that he had to say. But what I found interesting, which is more like a rally than a speech, right, to Congress, but what I found interesting was the statement by the Democrats following the speech by this new Senator Slotkin, an ex-CIA agent, right, Democrat Party now, one of the, one of their favorite candidates or members. It seems you got to be in the CIA or in the police or something here to get nominated for the Senate among the Democrats. Anyway, what did she say? Nothing. Not one alternative program announcement by the Democrats. There was a restatement. Oh, we got to stand by our allies in Ukraine. In other words, keep throwing more money down the Ukraine rat hole. Mm-hmm. And there was this kind of a weak woke statement. It didn't come out as direct about woke support, but that was still there. Right? And then there was a statement at the end that, we got to stay engaged and we got to have principled leaders. Stay engaged means don't abandon us voters, next time around, vote Democrat again. Right? And then principled leaders, as if the Democrats were principled. Right? I mean, war policies, war spending, chronic wars everywhere, supported by Biden, sanctions everywhere, undermining, their own empire, moving money off from the American Relief Plan to give it to investors and businesses, shit canning the Build Back Better plan that was supposed to continue. Spending on social programs, attacking, threatening a railroad, anti-strike for the railroad workers, right? Declaring from the beginning that there'd be no increase in the federal minimum wage. I can go on and on about the Democrats who have abandoned the working class. They were kind of abandoning it for a long time, right? But they've clearly abandoned the working class, and they've thrown up all this woke shit as a great distraction that we're supposed to vote for. Well, that formula is dead, right? But my point is the Democrats show no sign of coming up with an alternative program that would appeal to the working class. And I believe that the Republicans and the Trump forces will deepen their influence in the working class, which began in this last election. And that's maybe how you should see these working class tax cuts that are already embedded, right? In the tax bill. But, just to conclude, Trump economics believes that what he's doing will restore the empire. He believes that his moves will return the U.S. economic growth here to 3 to 4%. And he believes that growth will generate revenues, tax revenues, to offset his tax cuts. Also, he believes tariffs will raise money, and it will to some extent. It will boost GDP because it will reduce imports and net exports, contribution to GDP, right? He believes that his $5 million coin, right? Remember that, to all rich folks to come in, is going to raise a lot of money, right? The consumer consumption may increase because of these tax cuts for working class, middle class, if they pass, right? He believes that his tariffs will force American businesses and other foreign business to reinvest in the U.S., right? That will stimulate business investment and therefore tax revenues. Whether that happens or not, we'll see. That's a long-term thing. He believes moving the money around in the defense sector from all this foreign aid to stimulate new weapons development will generate more economic activity in the U.S., and his tariffs will force American companies to come back. That will generate more investment in the U.S. He believes deregulation will save costs for businesses and that they will reinvest that cost savings in production expansion, which isn't going to happen. That's an outmoded economic ideology idea here, that you cut business costs, that they will automatically reinvest it. See, that's the same thing for tax cuts or interest rate reduction or deregulation. The assumption is if you reduce costs, businesses will take those cost savings and plow them immediately back into the economy. Well, Keynes back in the 1930s totally debunked that whole idea. That's not how the system works. What happens if you cut costs for businesses? They'll just pocket it, a lot of it, right? Or they will reinvest it in financial asset markets, or they'll send it offshore. What's wrong in that economic ideology is the assumption that immediately you cut costs, right? That's going to increase corporate profits, and they will reinvest that immediately, with time zero, no lag and whatever. They won't hoard it. They won't sit on it. It's a totally debunked economic theory that business tax cuts or any kind of cost tax cuts, deregulation or whatever, will stimulate real investment. There's no empirical evidence of that. And we saw that with the tax cuts in 2017-18, right? $4 trillion. Did it stimulate anything? No. Trump's whole idea back in 2017 was that if we cut taxes $4 trillion, that will stimulate investment and bring back tax revenues. That's supply side bullshit, right? Tax cut bullshit doesn't work, right? And we saw it didn't work. We got a collapse in 2021, and the economy has been, just stumbling along at 2%, despite all that fiscal monetary stimulus, just like it did under Obama. Doge is going to cut $1 trillion in social spending, plus $1 trillion in war spending, defense spending, these measures that I talked about, $1 trillion. Well, I don't think that $1 trillion is going to be in more spending is actually going to be cut. That's going to be redirected somewhere. But the cuts in social spending, $1 trillion, Doge, are real. Those are going to occur. And how are they largely going to occur? Well, they're going to lay off and get rid of federal workers, aren't they? And then state and local workers. What's the cut in getting rid of the education department about? Well, just throw that cost onto the states. The federal sector is not going to have that cost and help balance that federal budget. But the problem's still going to be there. How you're going to fund education? The states, some of them will cut the hell out of it. But $1 trillion in domestic cuts. By the way, compare that to Obama. Obama in 2009 cut fiscal policy $787 billion, right? In August of 2011, he agrees with the Republicans to cut social spending by $1 trillion. So he gives $787 billion with one end to stimulate, then he takes $1 trillion away. And most of that, by the way, was cutting education. It's no different than what Doge is doing, but is the mainstream media talking about that? Not at all. Obama did exactly the same thing, and we got this slow growth, right? That Doge is doing right now, right? It repeats itself. The capitalists, when they have to throw money to bail out the system like they did in 2008-9 and 2021, it's temporary. When things settle down, they come around and they take away what they gave you during the crash, right? In 2008. But those are indications of the system becoming more fragile, you see. These repeated crises that occur on top of the financialization, on top of the globalization, on top of the fiscal and monetary policy and external policy not working the way it used to work. It's repeating itself. That's why I say we're at an attempt of a fourth restructuring, early phase, at the attempt of restoring neoliberalism, but it's unclear still exactly what this is going to result in. That's what Trumponomics is about in the context of previous restructurings and neoliberalism and the contradictions of empire and the contradictions of slow growth and fiscal crisis of the state. Okay, that's it for me.
Thank you, Jack.